presented by the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation. My name is Andrea Spindle. I'm the Executive Director of the Foundation, and I'll have the opportunity to introduce our guest, Dr. Aykan Erdemir, shortly. First, I want to tell you that the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation is based in Toronto and has been addressing anti-Semitism for almost 20 years and urging Jews and non-Jews to combat it by defending our basic freedoms, including both free speech and freedom of religion, forming interfaith alliances, and defending other persecuted minorities. Most importantly, we work to combat the unholy alliance between anti-Semites and anti-Zionists by presenting programs that educate people about the truth of Jewish history, such as the Balfour Declaration and the San Remo Resolution, both historical and legal steps towards the reestablishment of the Jewish homeland in Israel, the rightful home of the indigenous Jewish people. In conceiving of our series of web talks, we've titled them Anti-Semitism is a Virus Too. We are urging that everyone consider how to combat this pandemic. What are the antidotes for hatred? We urge Jews to recognize that in combating anti-Semitism, we must stand up for Israel and oppose its delegitimization on all accounts. And as we say at Passover, teach it to our children. Teach them Jewish history, Jewish pride, arm them with the truth so they're able to stand up to the never-ending battle to replace our history with fakery, lies, and bigotry. May is Jewish Heritage Month, and we have much to be proud of. Join CAEF in sharing our Jewish history and fighting anti-Semitism wherever it is manifest. Today's web talk will have the following format. Dr. Erdemir will give his presentation, followed by a Q&A. All microphones will remain off, so please submit your questions via the Q&A icon on your screen. I will read the questions and combine some if they are similar. You may write them at any time, and I'll do my best to cover all of your questions. It's now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Aykan Erdemir. Dr. Erdemir is the Senior Director of the Turkey Program at the Washington-based Nonpartisan Research Institute, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and a member of the Anti-Defamation League's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. He's a former member of the Turkish Parliament, and he served in the European Union-Turkey Joint Parliamentary Committee. He's also a founding and steering committee member of the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief, and a co-drafter of the Oslo Charter for Freedom of Religion or Belief. And he was awarded the Stephanus Prize for Religious Freedom in 2016 and the first Freedom Award of the Hellenic Leadership Council of America in 2019 in recognition of his advocacy for minority rights and religious freedoms. Dr. Erdemir received his MA in Middle Eastern Studies and PhD in Anthropology and Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University, and was the Deputy Dean of the Graduate School of Social Sciences at Middle East Technical University in Ankara. He has co-authored a number of books and many papers. I invite you to look into some of his writings on the FDD site. So please welcome Dr. Erdemir.
Thank you, Andrea, for the kind introduction and the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be addressing this distinguished audience today. My task is difficult. You know, this is a very complex subject, and I will try to make sure that I can convey the complexity of Turkey, both the challenges it poses and the opportunities it provides, both to tackle anti-Semitism and also to be a beacon for inclusiveness and pluralism in the Middle East and beyond. So let me begin with my own personal history, because that, I think, is a good way to start understanding Turkey's complexity. I was born in a city called Bursa, which is 3 hours south of Istanbul. And this was the first Ottoman capital. So back in 1326, when the Ottomans conquered Bursa from the Byzantine Empire, the city had indigenous Christians and Jews. And one of the first steps Ottoman Sultan Orhan I did in 1326 upon conquering the city was to invite the Jews back to the city and urge them to rebuild their synagogues. And the city then had, and these Jews are the Romaniot synagogues, Romaniot Jews who are kind of native to Asia Minor, to Anatolia, modern day Turkey. And then there was a second wave of Jewish influx, and that goes to 1492, to the Spanish Inquisition, to Reconquista. And then once the Jews were expelled from contemporary Spain and Portugal, they ended up in the Ottoman lands because the Ottoman Sultan back then sent his fleet. And it's rumored that he said, you know, how dumb the Spanish royalty is to be sending away all these wonderful people. So he welcomed them, and hence in my hometown there still are two Sephardic synagogues, Gerush, which means those who have been kicked out, and the Mayor synagogues. You know, these are the Sephardic Jews from Mallorca. And then there were also some Ashkenazi Jews. And this shows that once the Turkish Republic was established in 1923 on the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, and as it tried to transition into a secular republic from a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire, it had this mixed heritage, meaning it also had these moments of welcoming and embracing the Jewish community. But at the same time, those of us who know the Ottoman history knows that Ottoman history is also full of numerous atrocities and mass killings and targeting of religious and ethnic minorities too. And Turkey itself inherits some of that very mixed history and added to the complexity. Just to give you a couple of concrete examples, Turkey was the first Muslim majority country to recognize Israel in 1949. And also it was the same Turkey that welcomed a number of Jewish and other German dissident professors and artists and intellectuals during the Second World War. So it also provided them refuge. But at the same time, Turkey itself had its own history of pogroms in the 1930s. Then there was another pogrom in 1955, which targeted Greek Orthodox minority, but also ended up targeting and attacking Jewish individuals and religious sites. So again, Turkish history itself is also full of examples of embrace and equal treatment, as well as episodes of pogroms or hate crimes and hate speech. And one of the key take-home messages I have today is that given its complex history, with both history of anti-Semitism as well as embrace of Jewish individuals and the community, Turkey is a complex country that can either be one of the key drivers of anti-Semitism in the world today, or it can be a beacon for other Muslim majority countries to show that there can be a secular, democratic, inclusive, and pluralist future that manages to transcend this, what Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation rightfully calls anti-Semitism virus. Now, what complicates Turkey's story further is the fact that as of 2002, an Islamist party rose to power. This is namely the Justice and Development Party, known with its acronym, the AKP, run by Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Now, Erdogan became the prime minister in 2003. and now he is serving as Turkey's president. And when we take a look at his background, which explains a lot, we see that he comes from a very bigoted, intolerant, anti-Semitic, anti-Christian, and anti-Western worldview. The best way to provide a concrete example of his worldview is if we go back to his youth, when he was the director and the lead actor in a play he adapted in his school. And this play was called Mas Kom Yah. And this was the acronym for Mason Communist Jew. So this was an anti-Semitic, bigoted play that Erdogan not only adapted and directed, but he also played the lead role. And that should give us an idea of the background, the baggage he brought to politics. And then his political coming of age took place in Turkey's successive Islamist parties, where he was also indoctrinated with further anti-Semitic hate and further bigoted ideologies. Now, in 2002, Erdogan came to power not necessarily as an Islamist, but he promised the Turkish electorate that he has been reformed. He said, I have taken off my shirt of Islamism. He said, I'm now a Muslim Democrat, just like the Christian democratic parties in the West, and I am reformed. And many among Turkey's electorate were convinced, not me, but they voted for him in the aftermath of an economic crisis, and he came to power. And it didn't take him long to show his real face. That is, his bigoted, anti-Semitic, anti-Christian, anti-Western face. Hence, the Turkey that we have today is a Turkey that has been under Erdogan's rule for almost 18 years. And my talk is mostly about state-sanctioned anti-Semitism and what it really means for Turkey and the broader Middle East. Because we know that around the world, even in the most liberal and democratic societies, there is some level of anti-Semitism. So is the case in Turkey. But I think what's really worrisome is that Turkey's government, with its institutions, with its funding sources, with the political weight it has, is one of the driving forces inculcating prejudice and hate in Turkey through state media, through pro-government media, through the education system, through the official discourse of elected and appointed officials. And I think it is this part of anti-Semitism, the state-sanctioned part, that is more worrisome. And that is, in a way, socially engineering the Turkish nation with over 80 million inhabitants into an anti-Semitic society. Now, let me see if I can manage to share my screen with you to show you okay, I hope you're now able to see. So this is a photo from the 1990s. This is a photo from the pre-Erdogan era. It shows Israeli pilots in Turkey, hence you can see both the Israeli and the Turkish flags. And this is a time when Turkish-Israeli relations, both political, military, economic, and cultural relations, were at its peak. And hence, Israeli pilots were being trained in Turkey, given Turkey has a much larger airspace and offered Israeli pilots the space to train. Now, let me move to last fall, and this is a photo from the UN General Assembly. And here is Turkish President Erdogan using some props to target Israel directly at the UN General Assembly. Now, the reason I showed you those two photos is to show you that within 2 decades, you can see 2 radically different Turkeys. Politics and politicians do make a big difference, and state-sanctioned anti-Semitism does make a big difference. Now, just to give you a scale of how bad things are, as you might know, Anti-Defamation League regularly conducts polls around the world to measure the level of anti-Semitism across societies. When I was serving in Turkey's parliament between 2011 and 2015, one of those polls came out, and in that survey, to my shock, I realized that Turkey had higher level of anti-Semitism than that of Iran. So to me, that was a moment that Turkey should use to recognize the growing problem. And hence I held a press conference at the Turkish Parliament on Rosh Hashanah, just to remind my fellow co-citizens that although we take pride in being one of the rare secular Republican regimes in the Muslim majority world, it seems we have failed in falling victim to widespread anti-Semitism across the Turkish public, to such an extent that even Iran has a better scorecard. And then I filed a motion, the first in Turkish history, trying to set up an ad hoc committee to combat anti-Semitism. Sadly, Turkey's opposition, Turkey's pro-secular opposition, of which I was a member, does not have the majority to pass such motions through, and hence it did not materialize. But Turkey's anti-Semitism problem remains. And in fact, in subsequent Anti-Defamation League polls, we see that the problem is deepening. Now, of course, I have an explanation for this. People are not born with hate. They are not drawn directly toward hate. It takes, I always argue, it takes effort and resources to inculcate hate. And in today's Turkey, in the figure of Erdogan and his Islamist party, Justice and Development Party, we do have that source. We do have that push for anti-Semitism in Turkey. Let me give you one of the worst examples we have at hand. Those of you who are interested in Turkish dramas and movies might have come across a recent, blockbuster, which was disseminated around the world under the title, The Last Emperor. Now, this is a revisionist historical drama funded by Turkey's state-run public broadcaster, TRT, Turkish Radio Television, and broadcasted on Turkey's official broadcaster, TRT. And within this drama, the key message is that everything that led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire was a plot put together by Jews and Christians and other Western elements. And because this drama pretends as if it is a historical drama, the audience watching this blockbuster does not realize that most of the quote-unquote facts excuse me, presented in this historical drama are actually fabrications. And in our study, we have seen that each episode of this blockbuster led to a spike in hate speech targeting Jews. Just to give you a couple of examples, one viewer right after watching this drama tweeted, "I would like to turn the territory, between Euphrates and Nile into a Jewish graveyard." So we can show that there's a one-on-one relationship between state-sanctioned broadcasting of anti-Semitic hate, and spike in anti-Semitic hate speech and hate crimes. And this, of course, is not surprising. And we have also seen over the years repeated official utterances by Turkey's elected Islamist officials, as well as their appointed functionaries, bureaucrats. And what is worse than hate speech is actually the culture of impunity. That is, politicians and bureaucrats who know that they can get away with anti-Semitic hate speech, that this will not be detrimental to their careers, and that they will not have to answer either at the ballot box or in courts. Again, during my time in Parliament, there was a central government appointed governor in the city of Erdemir, which is near the Greek and Bulgarian borders in Turkey's northwest frontier. And the governor of the city reacted to Israel one day by condemning the Jewish community in Turkey, and then said that he would not allow the recently restored synagogue in the city to be used for worship by Turkey's Jewish community. I, again, in my role as a lawmaker who cared deeply about minority rights and religious freedoms and hate speech and hate crimes in Turkey, took this to Parliament. But that governor retired from office in that city, and he continued to serve in that city for years to come because he enjoyed the full protection and backing of Erdogan's government. And he's not alone. There have been numerous civil servants, from governors to teachers to professors to elected officials, lawmakers, ministers, presidents, prime ministers, who have used anti-Semitic discourse, and again, who enjoyed Turkey's culture of impunity. And that, I think, is also a key reason why we see these growing numbers of anti-Semitism. One could even argue that anti-Semitic hate speech could serve your career in the bureaucracy, could serve your career in the parliament, given you will always receive some level of grassroots support from fellow anti-Semites. But at the same time, I don't just want to give you a black portrait, because the picture is gray, meaning there are numerous allies when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism and all other forms of hate. Just to give you an optimistic take on Turkey, those of you who follow Turkish politics closely might have seen that last year, Turkey's opposition got its act together, built an umbrella coalition, and managed to defeat Erdogan in an uneven race in the top two cities, Istanbul, Turkey's financial capital, and Ankara, Turkey's political capital. And Istanbul's mayor, İmamoğlu, shortly after coming to office, on the occasion of Passover, tweeted a very warm Passover message, embracing Istanbul's multicultural heritage, including Jews and Christians and Alevis and ethnic minorities, including Kurds and Arabs and others. And that tweet led to tens of thousands of likes and positive responses across the Turkish religious and cultural spectrum. So just as hate could be contagious, we also know that inclusiveness, pluralism, and embrace could be contagious. So when thinking about Turkey, I think it's very important to realize that we're talking about a deeply divided, deeply polarized society. On the one hand, it does have a strong Islamist core, as represented by Erdogan, who is now in the presidential post. But at the same time, it has an equally strong, if not stronger, pro-secular, pro-Western, inclusive, and pluralist electorate that succeeded in electing secular mayors in provinces that have half the Turkish population and 2/3 of Turkey's GDP. So this, I believe, is a hopeful message concerning how Turkey could end up as, not only in building a secular, democratic, inclusive society, but also in becoming a beacon for other Muslim majority countries to emulate, that there can be a future beyond anti-Semitic hate, that Muslim majority countries can enjoy cordial win-win relations with Israel, that this could be mutually beneficial, not only for economic reasons, but also for security, for diplomacy, and cultural reasons. Beyond this, I think, I have prioritized politics as an institution because politics ultimately has a major role to play in combating anti-Semitism. But beyond politics, it's also important to realize that this is not just a top-down issue, because policy is also bottom-up, and social transformation is also bottom-up. And hence, come into the scene advocacy organizations, NGOs, and other civic initiatives, such as the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation. Also in Turkey, we see that there is a rich and diverse array of civic initiatives. And I think what makes Turkey's civil society one of the most vibrant civil societies in the Middle East, very important, is that they often come together to build alliances around such issues. I think it's extremely important not only to build a strong alliance for anti-Semitism, but also to build bridges with other advocacy organizations who also fight against hate speech and hate crimes targeting other vulnerable communities. Just to give you an example from my own life experiences. Knowing that a lot of these issues are transnational, with like-minded politician friends, with like-minded legislators from around the world, across the political spectrum and across the faith spectrum, we came together in 2014 to establish a global coalition, a global network called the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief, namely IPP4. And this initiative brings together lawmakers of very different walks of life around just one common denominator, and that is Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights. And that, I think, could be a good beginning point where, despite our differences, we can join forces to defend, to advocate for freedom of conscience, freedom of religion or belief, and thereby counter hate speech and hate crimes targeting ethnic and religious minorities around the world. And from the very macro level, that is a global coalition of lawmakers, to the grassroots, that is a coalition of civic initiatives that join forces to fight hate. I think this is a marathon, and it'll take all the resources we have, and it'll take not just years or decades, it'll take generations to change people's mentalities, to fight hate and prejudice. But as I always say, this is the only way, meaning it could be a long, difficult marathon, but given this is the only way forward, it's best if we begin today. So to make sure we have enough time to go into detail in any of the issues I've raised so far, I would like to end here for now and turn to Q&A, and I would be more than happy to answer all your questions and respond to all your comments. And thank you again, Andrea.
Thank you very much. That I actually had my pulse going faster as you spoke about the level of hatred that does exist. But I think there's some important positives that you've offered. A couple of questions. What is the situation for the Jewish community in Turkey? You mentioned several cities have still Jews from different backgrounds. How many Jews live in Turkey, and what is their situation?
Yes, thank you for giving me an opportunity to go deeper into the Jewish community, which I didn't in my initial remarks. So Turkey today, unfortunately, has less than 20,000 Jews left. And there are different reasons why that is the case, why Turkey's Jewish community dwindled over the years since the Ottoman times. With the establishment of Israel, there was an economic motivation for especially the lower and lower middle class Jews in Turkey to migrate to Israel for a better future. But then at the same time, there have also been waves of Turkish Jews who feared hate crimes, or who have witnessed or experienced pogroms and chose to leave out of a fear for their family members' security. And some of them ended up in Israel, but also others ended up in Europe and in North America. And to this day, this continues. For example, given that there has been a dramatic spike in anti-Semitism from the highest levels of the government, we now see that a lot of Turkey's younger Jewish individuals choose to study abroad and stay abroad, which is undermining the community in a way similar to that of Turkey's Greek Orthodox minority, because Turkey also had a very sizable Greek Orthodox minority, and over the years, again, for various reasons, including pogroms and hate crimes, many of them have either been pushed out or left on their own. And today, we have only several thousand Greek Orthodox citizens, and almost all of them are age 60 or up. So this is the future of the community is now at risk. So this might also be the case for Turkey's Jewish community if the trend does not reverse. But beyond that, let me emphasize one thing, and that is, although in a country of 83 million, 15 to 20,000 is a tiny minority, I would like to emphasize that Turkey's Jewish minority continues to play a significant role in Turkey's cultural, arts, religious scene and business scene. Turkey does have leading names in arts and culture and journalism and finance and business from among the Jewish community. Lately, despite the spike in hate crimes, the Jewish community has also chosen to be more visible. I know this could sound counterintuitive, but they have partnered with some of the sub-provincial municipalities in Istanbul, for example, to start holding first ever public Hanukkah celebrations in Istanbul's town squares. So again, I would like to underline that it's a very gray issue, meaning on the one hand, we have very alarming developments that further marginalize the Jewish community, but then at the same time, there are these other positive steps, which also reflect that Turkey continues to be a very divided country. So again, I think it's important to keep both in mind when thinking about Turkey's Jewish community.
Actually, you answered my second question very well, because I was going to ask about what level of society Jews had risen to. A question from one of our attendees is about your own situation. And were you intimidated or threatened, or is it safe for you to go back to Turkey? What happened with the fall of the opposition, so to speak?
No, I am one of the millions of Turks who have been politically and legally harassed by the Turkish government. All my assets in Turkey have been confiscated by the Turkish government. And I can't go back to Turkey as we speak. But if people ask me, I would have done all my activism in the exact same way, meaning I knew the potential consequences of speaking up for Turkey's ethnic and religious minority communities. This has been my calling from a very early age. My PhD dissertation at Harvard University was on Turkey's largest minority, namely the Alevis. And although I come from the majority community in Turkey, I'm ethnically Turkish. I come from a Sunni Muslim family. I could have enjoyed the privilege of being the majority, of being unmarked, but it is a moral imperative. It's a moral imperative that we do not stay silent while our friends, neighbors, colleagues are being persecuted for who they are or what they believe in. So in academia, then in my role as an activist, as an advocate, then in my role as a lawmaker, legislator, and today in my role in Washington, D.C. as an analyst, I have always pushed for equal citizenship, inclusion, pluralism in Turkey. One of the great honors I will pass on to my children, I think, is this legacy, is the fact that, I am one of the co-signers of Turkey's first, never but imperfect, hate crimes bill, that I have spoken out while many others who were in a similar position chose to remain silent. I think that's more important than the money I had back at home in my bank accounts.
Thank you for that. Thank you for taking those positions. What do you see as the possibility in bringing about change? You say it could take generations, but could this current president be ousted at the next election or in some other way? Could there be a change sooner?
Now, Turkey is today defined as a competitive authoritarian regime. What that means is Turkey is not a liberal democratic country. The elections are not necessarily free and fair, but there is still enough space, although it's an uneven, unlevel playing field, there is still a space for the opposition to win elections. And hence the term competitive authoritarian. It's authoritarian, but there is some room for competition. And I think the opposition has proven that it can defeat Erdogan at the ballot box. Even when Erdogan controls 95% of the media, even when he outmatches opposition election spending by 100-fold, still with the right ideas, with the right candidates, and with the right coalitions, the opposition can win elections. And this Erdogan had to learn the hard way last year. In fact, in Istanbul, when the opposition won a close race, he canceled the election, which was unheard of. He used the courts that he controlled to cancel the election and had a rerun. But to his shock, This time around, he lost with an even larger margin. So his tactics backfired. And this again shows us that although it's not an easy game, the opposition can still win elections. Turkey has the next presidential and parliamentary elections, combined elections, next in summer of 2023. And I think it will be extremely important if Turkish citizens can once again bring, the center right and the center left, and the secular and the religious, and the Turks and the Kurds, and the Alevis and Sunnis together to defeat Erdogan and his ideology of hate and extremism.
You didn't speak about the military, but does he control the military to the degree that they would back him to spite or to refute democracy? We saw something quite upside down in Egypt, where the election brought in an Islamist and the military were the secularists and had to throw out Morsi. Is the military going to support Erdogan? Is there a chance that they would not allow for the secular democracy you speak of?
Now, Turkey's military has been a black box. Over the course of the Turkish Republic, in most studies, you see a reference to the Turkish military as the bastion of secularism, as the guardians of the secular Republican regime. I have question marks about that because, especially during the Cold War, the Turkish military, with the motivation to fight communism, did support Islamists, did instrumentalize Islamist ideology, just like many others around the world did. And we know how that story ended, right? We know how investing in Islamists during the Cold War backfired for not only Turkey, but also for other Western democracies. Today, that military, which I have question marks to begin with, has been transforming rapidly. Erdogan has destroyed, during his time in power, the meritocratic promotion system within the military. He has been promoting hand-picked loyalists within the military. And increasingly, we see an irredentist, as well as not only nationalist, but Islamist discourse from the Turkish military, which we're not that used to. The Turkish military has never been perfect, but at least it refrained from Islamist, rhetoric. So I would argue that Erdogan today possibly sees the Turkish military as an ally against the opposition.
Right.
But I would like to believe that if and when the opposition wins elections, the military will realize its institutional heritage and will just continue to serve in its barracks and not in the political playing field.
Does Turkey have allies, the current government, I guess, really have allies that would work to also enforce Erdogan's continuation? And the other side of that is Western liberal countries taking note and bringing any pressure to change what is there, if not regime change, to at least press the government into being less constraining and restricting and abusive of personal rights?
Turkey became a member of NATO in 1952. During the Korean War, the Turkish troops were the second largest deployment after United States. And during the Cold War, Turkey was a major security provider to the transatlantic alliance, guarding NATO's southeast flank against Soviet Russia. But that Turkey is now long gone. Today, Erdogan sees Russia, Iran, China, Venezuela as his closest allies. And he has been increasingly pivoted away from NATO toward these authoritarian regimes. And hence, Turkey did go forward to purchase S-400 air defense system from Russia. And this was quite a turning point as a NATO member state buying a major Russian military hardware, from an adversary country. And so I would therefore argue that those regimes have a vested interest in keeping Erdogan in power, because it is thanks to Erdogan that they now enjoy this access to a NATO member state. In fact, Putin, I would argue, uses Erdogan as a spoiler within the Western alliance, as a Trojan horse within NATO, within the Council of Europe and other Western transatlantic institutions. Now, when it comes to Turkey's Western allies, I think so far what best describes the attitude is appeasement. So often Turkey's Western allies look the other way, as Erdogan was, just marching through over Turkish democracy, and most people legitimize this as saying, we don't want to push Turkey away. So they assume that appeasement would bring back Turkey toward the alliance. Now, anyone who knows world history knows that appeasement never delivers good results. And in the Turkish case, it actually escalated Turkey's descent into authoritarianism. And only lately we have begun to see some pushback. And it is no surprise to me that pushback started delivering results. Just to give you one example, when Erdogan launched an ill-advised hostage diplomacy policy in the aftermath of Turkey's 2016 abortive coup, and when he started arresting and imprisoning Western persons, including a US pastor, Pastor Andrew Brunson. And by the way, this is a strategy borrowed right out of Tehran's playbook, right? Hostage diplomacy is something Iran perfected. Most people look the other way. In fact, they assumed if they appease Erdogan, he will release these prisoners. But that did not materialize. It is only when, for example, the United States introduced global Magnitsky sanctions against Turkish officials and introduced punitive tariffs against Turkish aluminum and steel, that Ankara changed course. Pastor Brunson was immediately released out of prison, and then shortly after, a Turkish court ruled to set him free. And then we have seen similar developments with some German individuals, like German journalists in Turkish jail were released quickly once Germany started pushing back using some financial incentives and disincentives. So, which shows that authoritarian leaders like Erdogan, who have functioned through use of sheer force all their lives, from family to the level of state, unfortunately only understand this language of force and pressure. So I think that's what Turkey's Western allies need to do, meaning I always joke about it, bring large sticks and large carrots to the table, and that's the only language Erdogan would understand.
Okay, I have a question that's a little bit more complex. Turkey is primarily Sunni, as is Saudi Arabia, but it looks like it supports Iran in a number of ways. They are both supporting Hamas and other terrorist organizations, it would appear. I understand, and one of our questions is about the money that goes from Turkey to terrorist organizations. Is there a symbiosis there between Turkey and Iran, or are they operating just to gain independent influence over these groups?
That's a great question, because that is one of the most puzzling aspects of Turkish foreign and security policy. Now, historically, the Ottoman Empire, which was the main Sunni power in the Middle East, and the Safavid Empire, the main Shiite power in the Middle East, were rivals. And they not only fought these very bloody long wars, but they also clashed ideologically, religiously, in a sectarian fashion. But then at a certain point, from 16th to 17th century, we see a certain modus vivendi a certain moratorium in fighting between these two empires. And hence, Turkey's oldest border today is with Iran. It's the most stable, oldest borders because the two countries chose to stay away from one another. Now, that changed in a strange fashion with the rise of Erdogan to power. Again, Erdogan comes from a Sunni Islamist background, and just like many of his fellow conservative Sunnis, he has no love lost for the Shia community, meaning he sees them as heretics, and he has no sympathies whatsoever at a theological level. But since 1979, Turkey's Islamists have had a high level of reverence for the Islamic Republic and the political project that they represent. And this is the paradox of Turkey. That is, Turkish Islamists theologically disagree with Iran, but politically they see themselves as fighting the same war against the West, against what they see as the Judeo-Christian civilization. And this explains why Turkey was the one country that came to Tehran's aid at the height of US sanctions.
Oh.
Because it was Turkey, a NATO member state, that helped Iran evade US sanctions to the tune of $20 to $30 billion at the height of sanctions, when the regime was close to collapse. And in fact, it took people some time to realize that it is this secular NATO member republic, a Sunni majority country, that saved the world's leading, Shia Islamist regime. And I would argue this is behind that thinking. Similarly, the second biggest military and political center Hamas has outside of Gaza is in Istanbul, is in Turkey.
That's what I understood.
And so Hamas has Turkey and Iran as, strong co-patrons. And that again, we see that is a political union that transcends sectarian differences. And in Syria too, although Iran and Turkey are on opposing sides of the civil war, Iran backs the Assad regime and Turkey backs, Sunni fighters in Syria. Nevertheless, Iran, Russia, and Turkey have their own Astana process, a diplomatic talks to find a settlement in Syria. So I think the best take-home message is Turkish-Iranian relationship is extremely complex. Yes, there is some historical rivalry and ongoing competition and sectarian difference, but at the same time, there is an extremely strong bond that Erdogan has established with the Islamic Republic. And as long as that political Islam component is there to stay, Turkey and Iran will collude to undermine Western interests and to undermine secularism and liberal democracy in the region.
Wow. Okay, I think this is the last question. Is there anything that the West could do that would make a difference in as much as Turkey doesn't meet, as far as I understand from what you said, the real requirements to be a NATO member, other than providing a military base? If sanctions worked from the US perspective, as you described, and there are all these abuses that are in contravention of various treaties and United Nations declarations for human rights, the rights of women, the rights of children, the rights of minorities, etc. Is there a stronger sanctions program that would make a difference? Should Turkey be kicked out of NATO, for example?
Now, let me begin with the NATO question. I'm a strong transatlanticist. I have always been very outspoken about the importance of NATO, not only from a military perspective, but also from a political perspective for all the members. And I would argue that Turkey is such an important member state in such an important location that we should not hand Turkey over to Russia. But at the same time, we know that Turkey has been a dysfunctional member state under Erdogan. And for those of you who have ideas about expelling Turkey, let me tell you this: NATO is such an alliance that decision-making is unanimous. It never occurred to us, transatlanticists during the Cold War, that there could be a member state that defects while still remaining a member. So I think that's the challenge we have today. But still, regardless, I think the best way out of this paradox is to win Turkey back to NATO. And for the time being, what could be the incentives and disincentives at work? Let me begin with disincentives, with the sanctions. For example, US has a very effective sanction mechanism called CAATSA sanctions. These are sanctions that US could introduce for countries purchasing big ticket military hardware from Russia or China. And Turkey, as a NATO member, has just purchased the S-400 air defense system, which poses a major risk to the most advanced fighter jet NATO has, the F-35 jets, the stealth fighters, because Erdogan wanted to co-locate and cooperate the S-400 batteries with the F-35 jets. Now, the problem here is that the Russian equipment would be constantly eavesdropping with its radars on the stealth characteristics of the F-35 jets, not only undermining Turkey's own security, but all NATO members' security, because this would ultimately make the F-35 a less effective fighting tool against Russia and its allies. So one clear message US can still send Turkey is by introducing CAATSA sanctions against S-400 missiles. In fact, Erdogan has just refrained from activating the S-400 batteries last month, which he had promised to do so before, because he was fearing CAATSA sanctions. And he also knows that neither Russia, nor China, nor Iran, nor Venezuela are good financial partners during an economic downturn. Because ultimately, there is the best thing about Turkey is it's not a rentier state. It's not a hydrocarbon state. It needs to work and produce and export and tax its own citizens, unlike many of these oil states, which can just live off the rent from oil and other hydrocarbon sources. Which means Turkey does need Western markets. Turkey does need Western capital inflows and investment. Turkey does need Western know-how and business. And it means that Turkey's NATO allies also have strong incentives. For example, during the COVID-19 crisis, if Turkey is to survive the economic crisis, it will have to be through an IMF standby arrangement, a bailout with the International Monetary Fund, which we know comes with strong conditionalities for transparency, accountability, good governance, anti-corruption, and anti-money laundering measures. So I would argue that's a great path forward for Turkey. That is, economic reform could also be an impetus for political reform in Turkey. And so again, my overall take-home message would be what Erdogan's Turkey needs today is strong disincentives and strong incentives to get back on the path of democracy, free markets, freedom of expression, and freedom of religion.
It sounds like Turkey needs a good relationship with Israel to do that.
Definitely, because it has been a win-win relationship, just to emphasize that. When Turkish-Israeli relations were at its peak, Israel modernized Turkey's fighter jets, Turkey's tanks, provided Turkey drones, as well as intel in fighting terrorism together. And Turkey was a major source for various agricultural goods, various industrial goods, and also a very prized destination for Israeli tourists. And even now, under Erdogan, just to remind people, Turkish Airlines was the most popular airlines out of Tel Aviv, after El Al. So it shows that the bilateral relations are resilient and strong enough to endure Erdogan. And we should never forget that there will be a day after Erdogan when Turkey will be back on the path to democracy, inclusiveness, and cooperation.
Thank you. I want to thank you very much for a very enlightening and dynamic presentation. One of our attendees has a great suggestion, and so I will tell you that we would welcome you as the president of Turkey. I'll repeat that. She says, let's wait and hope that that happens. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who's attended today. It has been recorded, and there will be a link to on our website by next week that people can go to if you would like to hear Dr. Erdemir again or share this with your friends. And I will be sending out notice of future web talks next week. Please support the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, which has a very important role to play in fighting anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. One of our goals in Canada is to try to bring down the Israel Apartheid Week on university campuses, which is a major hate fest that needs to be revoked and gotten rid of. We fight BDS, which is always attempting to delegitimize Israel. And so we hope you'll join us in this battle. Thank you again very much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Andrea. And if there are any more questions, my direct message on Twitter is open to everyone, or you can also email me at aykanerdemir@gmail.com. I would be happy to answer any further questions. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.